Hello and welcome to the first of our Let's Talk Race podcasts, which build on the Let's Talk Disability series led by Professor Jackie Carter. In this episode, we'll be discussing broad themes around race, racism and ethnicity. We'll explore why conversations on these topics can still be so difficult, yet essential. To do so, we'll look back at the race riots of July 2024 and explore current anti-immigration protests that are taking place across the UK. This conversation will set the scene for future podcasts that reflect the experiences of the University of Manchester's racially minoritised colleagues, and considering current and future race equity work at the university that focuses on fostering belonging, inclusion and social justice through, for example, activities such as the Race Equality Charter, decolonising curricula and creating more inclusive learning and teaching spaces, the role of the early benefactors who founded the university and their relationship with the transatlantic slave trade, and the co-creation of the Manchester 2035 vision strategy as we look to create one university.
Great. Hi, I'm Sarah Fox. I am Director of EDI at the university. Why should we talk about race? Well, I think there's a climate of silence around race, actually. I think I was brought up to be quite silent on race. And yet the dynamics of race are playing out all the time. And I think if we want to have agency and be intentional about how we are within that, we need to talk about it.
Sheena?
Hi everyone, I'm Sheena Kalayil. I'm a senior lecturer in the School of Arts, Languages and Cultures, and until the end of July I was the Director of Equality, Diversity and Inclusion in SELC, in that school. So why do we need to talk about race? I think it's really useful for us to get together and talk about, what is still a difficult topic for some people to talk about, because I think we all have our very strong worldview, and I think we have to admit it's quite hard to change our worldview, and that includes our views on race, and those views are born out from our life experience, our socialisation. Also, maybe what we also have to try and do is see how we can bring our worldview to meet and match other people's needs and wants, and keep talking in order to recognise that it's not a settled issue, as some people might think. It's an evolving issue.
Okay, Duncan?
Yeah, good. Duncan, Ivison, President, Vice-Chancellor, and thanks, Dawn, everyone, for inviting me. We need to talk about race because it's still shaping the world we live in, right? It's shaping our world in very powerful ways, but in different ways than perhaps it has in the past. So for that reason alone, I think we need to still keep talking about it. It's still a force in our world, socially, economically, culturally, historically. So that's important. But also I think now let's specify the we. I think the university needs to talk about race, because universities should be places where we are actually turning our research, our teaching, our engagement with students, with our partners, with our community, our local community, our regional community, our global community. We need to be engaging people in deep conversations about race, bringing our expertise, bringing our knowledge, but also bringing, the next generation's views and questions about the nature of race and its impact on their world into focus. So I think as a university, we have a responsibility to talk about race as much as we individually should be, because it's still such a powerful thing in our world. So for me, that's something that's really important.
Okay, great. And I should say that I'm Dawn Edge. I'm a Professor of Mental Health and Inclusivity, and I'm also academic lead for the university around race, religion and belief. So I guess one of the things we could start by talking about is, we've all talked about the importance of talking about race still, and about how it shapes contemporary society with a historical link. And yet so many of us find it really difficult to do. So maybe we'll start with you, Sarah, about why do you think people find it so difficult to call it out?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I've thought about this very deeply over a decade in EDI work. And when I was a younger EDI professional, I used to kind of bowl into leadership meetings and be quite confronting on race and actually not get the reaction that I wanted and not move things forward constructively. And so I think what I've learned over the years is, first of all, the difficulty in talking about race or calling racism out is different depending on who you are. So what I've observed with white people particularly is that the barrier is often emotional. I think when we're confronted with racism in ourselves or in our organisation or in our community, the response is often to feel shame and that sort of this internal narrative evolves with this means I'm bad. And because we really dislike to feel shame as human beings, we want to get away from that. And so it can present as kind of retreating, so silence, or defensiveness, which can be kind of anger or denial. And I think that adds a layer of injury to people who are already experiencing racism. And what colleagues from Black, Asian and minoritised ethnic communities have shared with me over the years is that for them, the difficulty in talking about racism or calling it out is rooted in risk. So not wanting to be problematised or being put in a situation where you have to kind of carry the emotional labour of other people's education. And then I work with leaders a lot, and I think there's this extra layer for leaders, which is that there's an expectation that they should already know how to talk about racism and call racism out. And of course they should, but the reality is that many leaders haven't been brought up to be kind of aware of race and haven't been trained to work with racism in a meaningful way. So that's not good enough, but I do think it's reality. And I think that to move things forward, we have to deal with reality and meet people where they really are.
And it's really interesting, isn't it? Because we know that as a concept, race is actually social construction, and we know all the biology and all of that, and yet it's not so much for some people the issue of race that's problematic, it's racism and how that plays out at both at an individual level, but maybe certainly in the context of life chances, structural racism. So I don't know, Sheena, do you want to say a little bit about definitions? Because I think we still struggle to talk, to be on the same page about what do we mean when we talk about racism.
And in the university, of course, because we sort of acknowledge that race is a social construct, our ideas of race are really difficult to agree on. So, for example, a lot of people might think that white people cannot suffer racism. However, we have historical evidence of people who we would call white suffering racism. Italian and Spanish immigrants to Australia and the United States at the early days were considered second-class citizens or
Can I just put
late
in there
entry
and say
white.
something? Because actually, it wasn't that long ago that Italians and Spanish and Jewish people were not considered white.
I was coming on to Jewish people who've suffered a lot of discrimination and over the years, and of course Jewish people are of different races, but in Europe a lot of them are white. And so we come up against this academic argument around the social construct of race, which allows us sometimes to make it a bit more complicated than it is. And I think, we know when we see racism, but we have a fear of calling it out because of, Sarah expressed very clearly some reasons. But another reason why we don't like to call something racism, I think, is we believe that equality is a finite resource. And if we have our energies put into anti-racist activities, it will take away from any other anti-inequality activities. And that's a really difficult argument that I've had, over the years, that it doesn't have to be exclusive. We can come on to intersectional identities, but I've often come up against colleagues, academic colleagues, white colleagues who say, I don't feel like I've had a privilege, being white. I come from this kind of background, I have this issue. And so we're drawing ourselves away from talking about race all the time. And I think sometimes, we allow that because we have this knowledge of race as a social construct. It can also be, used as an excuse.
I mean, the other interesting thing for me is, the fact that something's a social construct doesn't mean it's any easier to address, right? There's almost an assumption that if something's socially constructed or it's a concept, somehow and I find we are living in this extraordinary time where it's easier to change the molecular structure of a cow or of even a human being than it is to actually do something about racism or other kinds of social and political disadvantage. So yeah, I think there's a really interesting sense in which we need to recognize that it is a persistent structural feature of our social world and our social imaginary, but it's challenging just for that reason, that it's so socially embedded. It's something that we need to recognize is something that's hard just for that reason, rather than thinking, oh, it's socially constructed, therefore we treat it differently than we would something that's a law of nature or is something that's hardwired into our biology or something, which of course it isn't. So I think I think you're absolutely right. There is something quite striking about the way we come at it.
I think that because it's so in-baked, it's kind of there, and you said, you know it when you see it, but lots of people don't, do they? They don't recognise it because...
I think there's a question about what does racism look like, and we've seen really good examples of what racism looks like, recently in UK society and other societies. They're easy to recognise, although there have been challenges as well, and we might come on to that as well. But within our university community, we're not going to be seeing, these overt signs of racism. And so I think we can become quite complacent that in our environment, when we're all, invested in furthering research, society, good, that there cannot be racism in the university. That's where the conversation becomes really quite difficult, I think. That we have to acknowledge it has always existed. And so why should we be immune from racism? It just may not manifest in these kind of symbolic acts or sort of overt symbols that we see, in society.
But I think that comes back to your point, which is that we've kind of agreed as a society, I think, that we are against racism. That is settled, but we haven't got an agreed, shared understanding in society, perhaps even within our organisation, about what racism actually is. And I think people think of racism as overt interpersonal interactions rather than the kind of structural racism that exists, in all organisations.
Do you want to respond to that?
No, I think you're right, Sarah. I think people are racists are so offended by being called racist. It's not something you're proud about. I wake up and say, yes, I'm racist and I'm proud of it. Nobody seems to want to be labelled in that way. And yet racism exists. So there has to be somebody out there, and I think we should include ourselves as well, as being capable of racist acts. I think we've all maybe been in a scenario where some of our actions could be considered as, that was probably overwhelmingly, orchestrated because of my views of race, and that in a way is racism. But I think, we want to talk about what's happening outside of the university walls as well, because I think last year there was they kind of overlapped in some ways. I mean, one of the reasons we thought about talking about race and talking about the podcast is during the race riots last year, a lot of us were sort of privileged enough to be able to work from home, and we could watch things on television. A lot of our university colleagues were coming onto campus, coming through Piccadilly train station. This is something I try to avoid doing, coming in through Piccadilly train station. And colleagues were on campus and felt threatened, and I think I'm not sure we supported them well enough. I know I myself shied away from putting my head above the parapet because I feared the reaction, or I was no longer sure that I would get support from any quarter if I, walked through Manchester or walked past the mosque on my way to work. So I think that needs to be talked about as well. How some colleagues in the university might have felt that what was happening outside was coming into campus as well.
Yeah, I think I sort of felt that too in a way. I mean, it was my first. I think it was my first week or my second week, maybe even the week before. And I think I said at the time that I felt as though the university hadn't really responded to the sense of being amidst an event like that in a kind of open enough way. Even if we were limited in what we could do, I don't think we were very purposeful about it in the moment. I mean, I think we've reflected on that and tried to adjust since then. And we're happy to talk more about that in due course. But I think it is something that universities have to be. It is being sensitive and open to what's happening around you and thinking about the consequences for your staff and your students and also your local neighborhoods as well. And in my view, that's something we really want to work on over the next few years. And it's talking about the strategy is one thing, but it's how do we as an institution use our convening power, but also our ability to think beyond our own campus, right, in all kinds of purposeful ways. So I agree. I think that's something that we had to really. I think it was a good moment for us to reflect on what could we have done differently, what more could we have done.
And I do think this is where people's lived experience comes into play, because I think we were all watching these things unfold on the TV and the news and so on, but they meant different things for different people. And they were felt differently for different people. So, for example, now we've seen the flags going up on the poles and so on, and some people will say, "Well, that's just being patriotic." But in that statement, there is an assumption that if you're black or brown or perceived as being of migrant or descended from migrants, that you can't be patriotic. And it also doesn't recognise that for some of us who've been around for a little while, who've gone through, my parents came to the UK when there were signs on shops and places, people trying to get places to live that said no dogs, no blacks, no Irish. That was what they came to. And then some of us went through a time when we had the National Front and the EDL walking through, going through Manchester, and there, depending on where you went to school, you might have had to walk through predominantly white areas to go to school as a British Muslim girl, and that terror that was there for some of us, that comes flooding back when these things happen. So, the fact that like last year in the riots, you might have to be coming onto campus because you couldn't work from home, and that's disproportionately people from certain ethnic groups, and you were having to get the bus, and you were having to get the tube. You couldn't hide from that. And then, we saw the images of people being beaten up. And I think there is sometimes a tendency for us to think that we are highly intelligent, sophisticated people, and we couldn't possibly be the kind of people who perpetuate these acts. But they don't happen in a vacuum. So even if you're not directly involved, they are still impacting us. And I do think, a lot of people I've spoken to now about the flags going up, and they just say, it is about terrorising people. That's what it's for. That's what
it feels like.
Yeah, that's what
I guess for me, it's how it's how an organisation listens to itself and listens to what's happening in its community, right? And, I think I've said it a few times now, but I think rather than just assuming, one has to be purposeful in actually seeking out the experience, if I can put it that way. And that's the work that Sarah does, the work that the networks do. And the work that the EDI leads do in the schools and the departments. Yeah, we need to make sure that those voices, those experiences are kind of making their way into the organization. I think sometimes we're not intentional enough about that. So that's sort of one thing I've reflected on since last year.
And so you've talked about our neighbourhoods and our communities, and actually the university is on the edge of a number of quite deprived communities.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think some of the responses to what happened in Southport and some of what seems to have been feeding into what's happening now is about people who feel that they've been left behind, who
yeah.
feel that, you know, they don't have a stake in society anymore. And so I just wonder what we all think is the role of the university in, I don't know, is it countering that? Is it highlighting that? Is it acknowledging it? What's
Yeah, I
our
think it's a
role?
great question, and you know, it's something we touched a bit on in the workshop we did on the riots, but something we want to do more of this year, which is where I think a university can really turn its expertise to is, those nuanced distinctions between someone feeling unhappy, disjointed, disconnected from their society because something's happening, migration, unemployment, technological change, skills and everything changing around them, the physical environment changing around them. How do we understand those often quite legitimate anxieties, uncertainties, concerns from, how do we understand those concerns without, in a sense, enabling them, or without assuming that they automatically translate into an expression of racism or an expression of hostility towards their neighbors? I think that's one of the most important social science questions for us, and not just social science questions. And I think we have a particular, responsibility to think hard about that question, because certainly the political parties aren't. Their incentives are very different. Their incentives are to mobilize those emotions in various ways, whereas I think our responsibility, our role should be to try and understand them, you know, as teachers, in terms of our students, as researchers, in terms of the questions we're asking in our research, but then also as an organization, right? How do we help create an environment in which, people can express their concerns, but they can do it in ways that are more constructive or more enabling than they are simply reactive. I think that's a really, really big challenge for us.
And I think sometimes, I agree with what you said, Duncan, but I think sometimes we have to just challenge people and treat them as equals. So rather than explaining to someone, you come from a deprived community and you might be feeling left behind, and so you're feeling anxious about migration or seeing people of different religions moving into the country, and this is the reason why you're feeling. Instead of explaining to them, I think we have to challenge them and say, if you're not happy with the policies that governments have, such as housing asylum seekers in hotels, you do not protest outside the hotel. You go to the government and you protest outside the policymakers. So I think sometimes we are still too nervous to call out that despite being, despite having difficulties and maybe legitimate worries, it is racist to place the onus or the reason for those worries on somebody who had nothing to do with that. I'm not saying that people who come to this country from other countries, myself included, and I'm an immigrant, or asylum seekers, lack agency completely. I'm not saying that. But I sometimes think we talk about deprivation and civil disobedience in a way that in the end excuses this appalling behaviour. If I could just mention three things that have really caught the country's attention: the Southport killings of young girls at a dance class, the grooming gangs in Greater Manchester, and more recently some sexual assaults of young girls allegedly by some migrants. All of these, what they have in common is a lack of society to protect women and girls. But in the end, what is focused on is the race or the colour or ethnicity of the perpetrators, as if this had happened by a white British person, it would be okay. So we're losing an argument about society's deficiencies through race. And just to remind everyone, the Southport and the Greater Manchester cases were enacted by British people. They were just brown and black British people. So once again, we come to this question about race. So I think we have to call it out for what it is.
So I, just very quickly, I obviously to understand something isn't to justify it or to provide sort of succor to someone's illegal behavior or bad behavior, right? But I do think these are genuine political issues in our culture, in our society. So, part of what we need to do is find a way to at least understand the difference between the kinds of anxieties that result in violence and hate and the kinds of anxieties that can be actually responded to in an appropriate way through public policy, through all sorts of other things. So I think that's really the issue. It's not in a sense to sort of justify or excuse the behavior. And of course, it's not us dictating to someone or lecturing to someone either, is it? It's just, how do we as an institution, in a world in which the incentive is to shout and to tweet and to get a soundbite, how do we as an institution that should be taking the long view and trying to understand things in their complexity, how do we contribute to a better grasp of these issues? But of course, we shouldn't be in the business of excusing appalling behavior, but we should be trying to understand the underlying reasons for it. I guess that's the thing I struggle
and not just but also the reporting of these things. So it was really telling, isn't it, that that with the Southport incident, that one of the things that that came out very earlier on was the fact that he was labelled as being a migrant, even though it turns out that he was born here. There wasn't a great deal of pushback from the media. Once they realised, it wasn't as though the media then kind of tried to do anything about that. They were quite happy to sit back and let that narrative kind of fuel what was going on, it seems to me. And the contrast between what happened in the response to Southport and what happened when that man got into a vehicle and drove it into the crowd at Liverpool and mowed down however many people, it's not been labelled as terrorism. And the image of him that was shown on the front of the newspapers was a guy in his white shirt, smiling, a family man he was described as. Whereas this 17-year-old with a history of mental illness, whom the system had failed on so many accounts, the image of him was like somebody who was demon-possessed, yet his hair was wild. And just that, that's how, this is when we talked about definitions of racism, that's how people don't understand that. Those images themselves are a form of structural racism. They're feeding a particular narrative about some people who are other and violent and mad and dangerous. But even somebody who drives his truck and tries to mow down hundreds, if not thousands of people, he's just a nice guy. He's a family man who just got a bit upset about something. See, and I'm not sure where, as a university, how do we feed into that the conversation, the education with a different kind of it. I don't know what your thoughts are.
I mean, I think that one very powerful thing that we can do, and when I joined after the riots last year, so I joined in about October, and there was a real sense of people being bruised from our response. And something I heard kind of repeatedly is that we didn't name it clearly. And I think one of the really powerful things that we can do as an institution is name very clearly what's happening. And I don't think that's difficult to say this is racism and, to so call it out riots, as well, and that these are race riots, as well as playing that convening role that Duncan's speaking about, which is super important. I do think we can be very clear and call it out clearly. I think that we need to support staff on the ground quickly and efficiently. And I think we've done quite a lot of work to kind of mobilise ourselves differently should further incidents occur. And I also think, and I am bringing it back to my field of work, that we need to continue to do the work of embedding belonging into our institution so that we can be a real role model in the world. But I think that naming it clearly empowers others who, might otherwise feel silent. So I think we have to be kind of quite courageous and clear about calling incidents out.
Did you want to pick up anything, Sheena?
No, I mean, I was just very moved by what you said earlier, Dawn, because I didn't grow up, in this country, but you were talking about how you had flashbacks to, earlier periods of your life, and I think that's what that's so important to hear the human side of all of this. And what's unfortunate is that you can even start thinking of the people who are writing. You can forget that actually they're human beings as well. And you're absolutely right, Duncan. We need to understand a problem in order to try and fix it. So I want to work on myself to not think of the massive people as the massive writers, but remember that some point in their lives something's happened to them that's made them so angry and feel that this is the best thing that they can do. I'm not condoning it, but I think I need to take a step back sometimes and think of that emotional side from the other side of this argument.
And we as an institution need to be led by the lived experience of our university community, our colleagues and our students who are actually impacted by racism in deciding what our response is. I think that dialogue needs to be really open, to embed a human perspective in what we're doing.
Of course, the challenge is in being led by that. There's deep disagreements about what the consequences are, right?
Yeah.
Which, of course, I welcome. That, and like I said, I think about, I reflect a lot on what's our role, both in, curating appropriate conversations and what we've been talking about, and really powerful insights, that each of you have shared. But then there's also, we have to be honest too. There's really deep disagreement within our university community about, if not about naming racism or naming the disadvantage that we care about, certainly about what we should do about it. And so I feel really strongly that we've got to find ways to have those conversations, to talk about them, and then decide on what we think the appropriate response is. I mean, at one level, there are just basic things we need to do. People need to be safe. People need to feel as though they can, do their best work, and we need to be very purposeful and pragmatic and practical about that, and we haven't been in the past, I think, probably as much as we should. But then there are more complex questions that we then have to grapple with from there, I think.
We are a very complex kind of organism, a university, because we have people who are very passionate about their subjects. It's a global institution, and so we have people coming from different parts of the world with their own worldviews. We have different layers within the university, different types of jobs. We attract people from different parts of Manchester. We want to reflect Manchester, but we also want to be this research-intensive global university. And I think we are a very complex organism. But maybe what we need to do, what I often sort of chafe against, is this idea when we talk about community, we always mean outside of the university, and we often mean the deprived communities around the university building. But we are the community. We are Manchester as well, and so I think we need to sometimes, be bolder about talking about ourselves as being part of this community, the city's community.
I also think there will be deep disagreement. There will be conflicting views. But my experience over, a decade of working in EDI is often people do just want to be included and heard and considered. Of course, we're all attached to our own worldview in some way, but people don't expect their worldview to be fulfilled, but they do want to be included and heard. And I think we can continue to do that more and better.
Yeah, no, I think that's really important. I completely agree. There's a difference between just, as it were, a straightforward disagreement and expressing your view, and some kind, without over-intellectualizing it, and what you might call deliberative disagreement or discursive disagreement or whatever, however you want to phrase it, right? There's a big difference between those two states of affairs, and I think you're absolutely right. We should always be aiming for the second, not just an expression of the first.
I'm conscious of time. We need to come to the end of our conversation. So maybe, Sarah, you talked about belonging and how the extent you thought that was really, really important. So maybe I'd ask you to think, to reflect on that for us and about what that might mean for us as an institution. And then maybe, Duncan, you could talk about a little bit about our 2035 strategy and how this can feed into it, and have people's opportunities to be able to contribute. And then maybe if you could wrap up, Sheena, with what we've got out of today. Okay.
Yeah, so we are at the minute doing the groundwork for our next EDI plan, which is going to be a 10-year plan to mirror Manchester 2035. And as part of that, we've taken a really deep, honest look at where we are right now. We've worked with an external consultant to do that. And the feedback has been that we've got great policies, we've got great comms, we've got great training, and it's not tracking through always to people's lived experience. So for me, this next kind of phase of our EDI work, which will mirror Manchester 2035, has got to be about closing that gap.
Okay.
Yeah, and I mean, I guess for us, and we've been spending the last 8 months, as you know, thinking and talking and discussing and arguing about our strategy for the next 10 years. And really, one of the golden threads of the strategy is the way in which we embed that commitment to equity and inclusion and diversity in everything we do as an organization, and not just in relation to the teaching we do and our relationship with students, but also our relationship with our immediate communities and broader relationships in the region, and then extending out nationally and globally. So I think a real test for our strategy is whether colleagues feel that is genuinely embedded in our ambitions for the next 10 years. Now, my own view, in a nutshell, is the most successful universities are the most inclusive universities. You teach more effectively, you do better research, you ask better questions, people are able to do their best work in universities that really live their values when it comes to a strongly inclusive culture and embracing the diversity of that culture. So that's the ambition, and I think the test, and I've heard it loud and clear in many parts of the institution, is, you know, are we serious about that? Is that going to be real? And I think that's the challenge for us, I think, for the years ahead.
Okay. Sheena.
So, I mean, I think what we've seen from this conversation, there's a high percentage count of migrants on the sofas here. I think Duncan and I are both migrants here. I think what we've seen is a willingness to listen and learn from each other, but also an openness about, you know, what we're not getting right, how we're trying to make things better. But also, I think importantly, that we are not hermetically sealed from society. And as a university, we have a duty, you know, to look outside as well as to look inside and look inwards. I think that pretty much wraps it up.
Well, thank you all very much for what's been a fascinating conversation, and we'll look forward to the next 3, I believe they're going to be topics to be agreed.
Good stuff.
Thanks
Thanks,
very
Don.
much,
Thanks,
everyone.
everyone.
Yeah, thanks, Dawn.
Thanks.